So we've been hearing for a long time that we're facing a climate crisis, and that this is a defining crisis, that this is a priority, and within that conversation, a lot of what we're told is that the biggest danger are those who deny the climate crisis, who deny that global warming isn't happening, and we need to orient ourselves to fight these people and institutions who are saying that the climate crisis isn't real. And I think that the time for that kind of thinking, I don't think it was ever actually very valid or legitimate, but I think the time for that thinking has long since passed, and that for a long time now, the most dangerous institutions and discourses and practices on the planet are the ones who are telling us to think about the climate crisis and telling us how to think about that climate crisis. From governments, from progressive and centrist political parties, from academies and universities, from social movements and NGOs, from green businesses. A huge section of society is telling us there is a climate crisis. That is where our focus needs to be, and we need to participate in a certain array of proposals that are designed to respond to the climate crisis. That, I think, if we're looking at the strategies of power, is probably the biggest actual danger to our collective survival right now, is actually this intersection between the institutions of power and the more mainstream parts of the movement. And there's a lot of different ways that we can get into this, and that we can attack this question of different discourses, different understandings. And so I'm just going to pick one. I'm just going to jump into it. So we do know it is factual that the composition of the Earth's atmosphere is changing in a hugely dramatic way, and that is having catastrophic consequences. That's a fact. And we also know that a huge part of this change is being caused by the burning of fossil fuels. This is another fact. This is well established. And so what we're told is that, therefore, the logical step is to increase our production of green energies. This makes perfect sense, right? I'm going to need some volunteers. Are folks over here all right if I ask you to stand up? I'm going to need 10 volunteers. If anyone doesn't want to stand up, you don't have to. I'm going to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, look at that. 5 and 5. Are all of you in the first 2 rows okay standing up? Is that all right?
I'm not super okay with
Okay.
standing.
Yeah. Okay. So you want to stay standing up, and if you could sit down, and then okay. So we got 10 people standing up. Thank you, all of you. Those who stood, those who didn't. These people, they represent the totality of global energy production, right? Boo. Okay. So this is where it's all going wrong. This is all the energy production around the entire planet. All right. You represent green energy. All right. And if you could maybe cut off 2 fingers, because it's actually about 11-12%. Like give 2 fingers. Okay, you don't have to. Okay. So it's this friend here and a little bit more. That's green energy, right? They're the good ones. All the rest bad. Boo. Boo. Okay. So obviously, logically, so actually, are you raising your hands? Yeah. They're just no, not you. No, bad. Only you. This is the good energy, right? All the rest is the bad energy. So it's logical, right, that what we need to do to solve this problem are we need to get more of these bad fossil fuel energy sources to raise their hands to become green energy, right? And that's what we're being told. What we're being told is that by 2030, if you 3 could raise your hands. By 2030, we need at least this much of the total global energy production to become green energy, or even better, you got some tea. Would you mind raising your hands too?
I can also.
Oh, okay, all right.
I'm multitasking.
Okay, yeah, look at that. All right, that would be ideal if we could, do some multitasking, put down the tea, and get up to this proportion of green energy. That's what we're being told. This is what we need to do to survive. All of the universities, all of the institutions of power, all of the governments that are not currently denying climate change, groups like Extinction Rebellion, all of them are saying this is what needs to happen by 2030. and the media are repeating it, and everyone thinks that it makes perfect sense, and it is an absolute fucking lie. Why? Let's sit down. If you spend 1 minute, just 1 minute, learning about, what's the name of the economic system that we have around the whole planet now? Capitalism, right, that's what it is. If you spend 1 minute learning about capitalism, what is the fundamental feature of capitalism?
Expansion and growth.
Expansion and growth. It is based on growth. All right. So, really quick, one more time, if the 10 of you could stand up again. Sorry. It will not be, the whole thing will not be like this. Okay. Those 10, they represent total energy production around the world in 1950. We need, I think, 55 more people to stand up. We're going to need to get some people in from outside to complete the exercise. So can someone go outside and bring in about 10, 15 more people to complete the exercise? That's how much energy production is now. If they are the energy production of the entire planet, of all of human societies on the entire planet in 1950, it has grown so much that now it wouldn't fit in this room. So it's not just the incremental growth either. It is exponential, constant growth. So what does that mean? First of all, more green energy does not mean less fossil fuel energy. That is an absolute invention. That is worse than wishful thinking. But in fact, it's worse than that. Not only does more green energy not mean less fossil fuel energy, more green energy means more burning of fossil fuel energy. Why? How many people here have like a fossil fuel setup in their house, like a coal mine, a gas refinery, oil pipelines? No one? No one. Isn't that weird, right? Okay. Fossil fuel infrastructure, we can kind of reductively refer to it as fixed capital, right? This is money that capitalists have spent that is fixed. It has a fixed form and a fixed way of making more capital. Because that's what capitalists live for. They have decided that their purpose on this earth is to take money, to invest it, and to use it to make more money. That is their purpose for existence. So when they spend millions and billions and trillions of dollars or euros or whatever making oil refineries and coal mines and gas pipelines and all of the rest, that's fixed capital because it's not liquid capital. Liquid capital is money in the bank account. Liquid capital is often real estate, things that can be switched from one form of capital and one form of investment to another relatively easily. Even though there have been some plans to try to turn old coal mines in West Virginia, where they've done mountaintop removal, into shopping malls, it doesn't really work. A coal mine is a coal mine is a coal mine. A gas pipeline is a gas pipeline. These things do not easily become other forms of capital, and they do not have other ways of generating profit. In order to generate profit, they need to keep producing what they produce, which is fossil fuels. Or the capitalists who invested that money in them lose their investment. And they have decided that making money is more important than life itself. And that is who they are. That is what a capitalist is. It is someone who has decided that making money is more important than anybody's life. And we can never forget that. So when they have all of this fixed capital, which is really good at making them an extreme amount of money through the burning of fossil fuels, and then all of a sudden fossil fuels get a bad rep, and then all of a sudden you have new sources of energy that are appearing, industrial scale solar, industrial scale wind, hydro, that require very different forms of fixed capital that are often not transferable, although that's complicated and there is actually a lot of integration. That's a potential threat to all of this money, all of this capital that these capitalists have spent. So what they need to do to continue making money is to produce more. The profit margins might go down, but if they just produce more, then they will continue making just as much profit or more profit. And that is a basic feature of how capitalism works that anyone who cares to could find out with a half-hour study group, right? that the predictable result of encouraging green energy production on an industrial scale is the burning of more fossil fuels and the accelerated destruction of life on this planet. And that was a predictable result from the beginning. And if you look at the stats, that has been the result. That has been what has been happening. And regardless, not in the mainstream media, not in the progressive media, not in a lot of groups like more mainstream groups like Extinction and Rebellion and stuff like that, and certainly not in all the universities and academies, for the most part, with very few exceptions, have they been honest with us at any level to say, honestly, if you look at this plan for half an hour, it falls apart. And it turns out that this plan is actually good for the capitalists. It is not good for the planet. It is not good for our chances of collective survival. This plan is going to make things worse. And that is exactly what has been happening for decades. And they have not been honest with us about that. And that is extremely problematic. When we think about what institutions do we trust, what kinds of social movements and strategies do we trust going forward, when people have been lying to us for decades on the question of everybody's survival, that's a line. That's a line that should not be crossed. And once we see that there are institutions or individuals or movement figureheads or academics who cross that line, there should be serious doubts about ever dialoguing with those institutions or those people again. Because it takes half an hour. It would have taken half an hour in 1968, when some of these first studies were coming out, to say, obviously industrial scale green energy is just going to make the problem worse. Eventually, we'll get to a point, the tipping point, where green energy is growing faster than fossil fuels, and where new green energy projects actually start very slowly replacing fossil fuel projects, but it is the slowest possible way in existence to make that happen. It would be impossible for the most creative bureaucrats in the world to think of a slower way to get us on the path towards survival, right? That's green energy. That's the whole 2030 carbon reduction plan. That's what we are all being convinced is our big hope for survival, while they're telling us that some weird fucking right-wing freaks who can't even look outside and see that the weather is changing are the bigger danger. They're not the bigger danger. The bigger danger are the ones who are in charge of the solution right now. And additionally, I won't go into the details, but in fact, green energy projects on an industrial scale are fully integrated with currently existing fossil fuel projects and other extractivist projects. They are responsible for a huge amount of environmental devastation around the world. And fortunately, we also have a couple people here who have been putting a lot of energy into doing that research, all the while getting silenced or getting maligned by the respectable parts of the movement who say, you're not being a team player. We all gotta convince everyone that climate change is real and get everyone on board for this plan of like more wind parks, more industrial scale solar energy, and more hydro parks and all the rest. Maybe nuclear too. So green energy is on an industrial scale is extremely devastating. It's completely tied into some of the biggest colonial land grabs that are happening in the 21st century. Lithium mining, wind parks, solar farms. Just one quick example, huge hydro parks in Oaxaca, Mexico, that the electricity is used to power sweatshops as part of the whole NAFTA free trade system. It's all about production. It's all about making profit. It's not actually about survival. And it doesn't do anything to decrease the burning of fossil fuels. I don't think it even really helps to talk about a climate crisis. I haven't necessarily seen that talk about a climate crisis has been very useful at teaching people, at least like mentally colonized people, white people, to like stick their heads out the window and like notice the weather, notice the world that we're actually a part of, to actually feel the changes, because you don't need to see the studies. You just need to feel. You need to remember what it was like last year and the year before that, and you know that it's changing. And then you don't need any scientific institution to tell you whether or not the weather is actually changing. If this emphasis on climate were actually an emphasis on climate in an embodied way that taught us to be here in our bodies, in the territory that we inhabit, and to notice what's going on, that would be a useful thing. That would be a valuable thing. But that's not really what's happening. When they talk about climate, they're talking about parts per million carbon dioxide. They're talking about gradations of Celsius that are changing every year. Just more technocratic measurements that are bringing us out of our bodies and out of the territories that we actually need to survive in. How many of y'all have the means at home to measure parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? No one, and there's even academics here, and no one has that. How many of you here are capable of remembering what's a migratory bird that you all have in Finland that comes up in the spring? Anyone? Swans?
All kinds of birds.
Sure. How many of y'all are capable of remembering when they arrive and when they leave from year to year? It's depressing showing hands, but it's a few. It's better than the other one. How many of y'all are capable of noticing the weather and noticing when it's snowing, when it's warm, when it's hot, when it's raining? All of us. Isn't it weird that when they talk about the climate, they don't talk about those things? They don't talk about migratory species. They don't talk about the weather that we actually experience. They talk about ppm carbon dioxide. Isn't that strange? I wonder why that would be. A climate crisis would be already a huge problem. Just the change in atmospheric carbon that we're facing would already be a huge catastrophe. That in itself would be a question of survival. But it's a completely different question of survival when ecosystems are dying or going through massive change, and the living things that make up those ecosystems are able to move. When they don't encounter highways, when they don't encounter borders, when they don't encounter dead zones and militarized police and ID checks and industrial parks and cities that are urbanized in a way that they're not thought of as habitats, they're thought of as real estate markets. That would be an entirely different crisis. I would love to inhabit that crisis. We could just focus on we didn't fuck up. Someone fucked up. It's the language is okay. They're probably too small. Okay. Whatever. Someone fucked up. This is horrible. Millions of humans are already dying every year because of lack of water, lack of access to food. So many species around the world are at risk of extinction. Most of the habitats on Earth are at some kind of risk and are going to have to adapt and to change. But let's change together. Let's move. Let's take care of each other. If we have enough, let's welcome people who have to leave their homes, which is a traumatic fucking experience to have to leave your home for survival. But let's do that together. Let's welcome the swans. Let's welcome all of the different living things, human and non-human, the forests that have to migrate and shift. Let's do that together. That would be fucking amazing. And that would be so easy. But that's not the crisis. The crisis is the borders. The crisis is our industrial infrastructure that despoils the landscape and that makes it so that the earth is not connected and that all of these living systems can't do what they've been doing for the entire history of life on this planet, moving, shifting, adapting, and surviving. That is the real crisis. So calling it a climate crisis, when I hear people talk about a climate crisis, I feel like we might as well just give up. We might as well just commit mass suicide, and then at least we can have the dream that all the fucking rich people, when they don't have anyone to work for them, they're going to starve to death because they're absolutely useless. They'll have their golf courses and their giant mansions, and they won't be able to grow their food because they won't have anyone working for them, and we could at the very least have the last laugh. But maybe we could actually recognize the crisis we face and inhabit it and give it everything we have and actually address the real crisis, which is so much more than a climate crisis. It is a crisis of survival on every level. usually referred to as an ecological crisis. I'm often afraid of doing that around white people because like white people will often think like, you know, ecological environmentalism, like nature and humans. Like, no, please, no. So kind of more etymologically, ecological, ecos, home. It's the word for home. So the ecological crisis is the crisis of our home, which is necessarily a crisis of ourselves and our possibilities for survival. So I think it's absolutely vital to recognize that the crisis that we are facing is intersectional, it is global, and it touches every single aspect of life and survival. Geologists lately have been patting themselves on the back for taking this really seriously and launching this new proposal that the current geological epoch should be referred to as the Anthropocene. Now this is a big deal because we've only been in the Holocene for like 12,000 years. And so a geological epoch, it is sort of like a nomenclature for naming periods of the planet's history. And the planet's a pretty old thing, right? And so an epoch typically lasts from like 2 to 50 million years. So if one epoch, the Holocene, started just like, I think 12,000 years ago, if I'm not remembering correctly, it would be pretty unusual to start a new epoch already. Because usually, like I said, they last several million years. Well, what an epoch is, if you imagine like some alien civilization could come from another planet 1 billion years from now, they could do like a test on the layers of rock that are being formed right now, and they could say at this scale what is happening in the planet. What's the composition of the atmosphere? What are the life forms like? What's going on volcanically, throughout the depth of the planet? An geological epoch, it's a big deal, right? It's something that is inscribed into the rock of the planet and will be as long as the planet exists, which is why these things usually last millions of years. So the geologists are like, we're taking this seriously by proposing a new name for a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, because they are recognizing that until the sun expands and consumes this planet and the planet Earth is no more, anyone with the instruments will be able to do a test on the layers of sediment that are being formed by living beings and by volcanic activity and by erosion right now and being formed into the new layers of stone, and they will be able to find new radioactive isotopes from nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. They will be able to find a sudden and unprecedented spike in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. They will be able to find evidence of mass die-offs. What they're trying to say is, take this seriously because this is serious. But what have the bastards gone and called it? The Anthropocene, which means the geological epoch defined by human beings. How long have humans been around? Any, shout it out, any guess? 200,000 years? 2 or 3 million years? There's a debate around like where, what's the limit, where to define the line of being human. The different proposals are usually in that range, but in fact, you're all wrong. Human beings have been around for about 200 years, according to our geologist friends. Just 200 years, right? Because if what's happening now is the geological epoch defined by human beings, we can't see any evidence of this if we go back more than 500 years, and the slightest little precedence for evidence on a much smaller scale in just a few small corners of the globe going back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. But in general, this kind of ecological planetary-wide transformation, there's no evidence of that going back more than a few hundred years. So obviously, what the geologists are saying is that they've just discovered that humans have only been around a few hundred years. And whatever it was before, well, that must not be human. It must have been something else, right? So since the category of humanity really started getting used in European philosophies, there has always been a huge amount of policing around who qualifies as human, who can legally be enslaved, and who can legally own property, including other living beings. who can steal someone's land and write up a piece of paper and say, this is my land now? And who can get their land stolen? And who can be sent off to death camps if they don't agree with that process? Who has the right to have some kind of state speak in their name and make their language official and set boundaries and create a national history that supposedly tells the story of one group of people and not another group of people? Since this category of humanity has been universalized, it has been an act of police activity, defining those boundaries. Who is human and who is not? And then finally, when various liberal revolutions started saying, okay, maybe we need to be a little bit more universal with this category of human, there has been only an increase in resources, of education, of culture, of policing, of death squads, teaching everyone who is not white, everyone who does not come from the colonial center of what has become a world civilization, what it actually means to be human, how to be properly human, so that you can get your rights, so that you can participate in the political structures that were made global by colonialism, so that you can participate in the economic structures made global by colonialism, so that you don't get sent to prison or are less likely to be sent to prison, so you don't get sent to death camps, so that you can have politicians who speak your language and will refer to a national history that glorifies your sense of self and all the rest. And finally, for the first time, when they finally consider the possibility of saying, okay, fine, no holds barred, everyone's human, it's right at the moment when it comes time to share the bill. That is the first time that the institutions of power and that the mainstream media and that the universities and the governments and all the rest have been even capable of conceiving of the possibility of an actually universal humanity. When it's to say, humans just destroy the environment. That's just what humans do. And so the crisis that we're facing is the anthropocene. It's the geological epoch defined by human activity. This is not human activity. Enslaving and carrying out genocide and cutting down forests and treating life as a commodity and letting people die if they can't pay for their means of survival or if they can't find someone to work for, those are not human activities. Those are monstrous activities that are at the center of institutions that are trying to preserve themselves, that are facing a crisis of survival and are doing everything possible to convince us to have their backs, to protect them, when what we need to be doing is setting fire to them as fast as possible and getting rid of them as a question of survival and a question of decency, a question of solidarity, and of what we owe to our ghosts, what we owe to all the people and all the living beings that we have lost and that we are losing. Because this is not a future crisis. This is not a crisis of 2030. Tens of millions of people are already dying every single year because of lack of access to water, because of lack of access to food, dying on the borders, dying from warfare caused by states that are fighting over diminishing resources, that are trying to preserve their institutional legitimacy, getting shot by cops because that's what cops do. And we are being, all of the media and cultural and academic resources of global society are being geared towards convincing us to save them. There is no life possible with those institutions. There is no life possible with the state. There is no life possible with the police. There is no life possible with capitalism. There is no life possible with colonialism. All of these are institutions and frameworks that are founded on, I don't even want to say death. Like, death is a part of life. Like, I don't know, when you get a brain tumor, you like death is going to happen. It'll be fine. But only when we always come back to the living, when we use our lives to give back in whatever ways we can. They don't even respect death. They are machines that all they can do is consume life and turn it into something that is not life. And we will never be safe as long as they are around. And I think we need to make distinctions around solidarity and we need to be compassionate, we need to be patient. I don't think it makes sense to understand like police or other mercenaries like that as human beings. I don't think it makes sense to understand states as as living things that can be dialogued with. It gets more complicated in the social movements. When you have naive people brought up in this society, taught, certain cultural values to preserve, who gear all their activity into dialogue with the institutions that need to be destroyed. But we do need to find ways to engage with those people, to engage with those perspectives, and let them know that that is not acceptable, that lines have been crossed, and that it's already far too late for a lot of us, but there's still hope for survival. Life will continue in one way or another. And we really have a scale of urgencies before us. For a lot of people in a lot of forms of life, it was too late 500 years ago. The apocalypse began 500 years ago. In other corners of the world, 2,000 years ago. In other places, life is still holding on. For the last 16 years of my life, I've been living in Catalonia, and for like a part of that outside of the city. And like every year, I kind of noticed I started just like paying attention to the birds, the migratory birds. And there's this one species, El ballester. I don't know what it is in English and much less Finnish, but it's a migratory bird related to a swift, like big long wings. It's related to a falsiot, that's a beautiful name because fals is like the sickle that you like harvest wheat with, and so it's like a reference like the shape of the wing. So like if you think of that wing shape, you can probably think of the bird that I'm thinking of. The ballester is it's like a bigger falsiot. With like a brown back and like a white belly. And it's one of like 5 kind of related species of birds that you never see them land. They're always swooping around, eating insects. 5 different species that I was really lucky to share that land with, that would come back every spring and leave every fall. Last year, there were just 1 or 2 ballesters that came up from like, big family groups in the past. And they just got completely absorbed into like the community of falsiots. So similar bird, they just kind of adopted them, as living things do. Solidarity being a principle of life. And this year, I was back there this spring, and for the first time, there weren't any. So it was like the first year, like, have to like say goodbye to like some neighbors who I'd like spent the last few years getting to know. And it was beautiful the year before that like they weren't enough to be like their own community, that they could be like invited in. And that's what we need to be doing. Like every year, some of us are going to be disappearing. I'm sure more and more of us are losing people to suicide in our communities. It's happening more and more, or for other reasons. I'm in the process of moving back to the States, which is probably a pretty insane decision, but whatever, apocalypse, go with it. And in where I'm living, we recently lost someone who recently just got killed in Ukraine. I know, lots of us these last years have been losing people. It's getting harder and harder, but what we have to do is we have to keep coming back to one another. We have to keep coming back to this common space, because that's where survival is possible. So I don't like to talk about a climate crisis, and definitely not the anthropocene. But we need to talk about survival. So there are very big questions wrapped up in all of this, obviously. We need to be thinking from a global perspective, obviously. That in itself, though, often leads us towards certain assumptions that I think sabotage the work that we need to be doing. So let's take the question of food, right? Obviously, food is treated like a commodity in our society. That makes it harder for people to get access to it. And when you have big climatic shifts and you have an entire industrial agricultural system that's designed a certain way, and then the rain stops falling, or you have flooding or other things like that, the temperature ranges shift, you're often going to have big problems with productivity in food, right? So it makes a lot of sense to think about food supply. What What are some of the basic food sources in Finland? Potatoes? Oat?
Is it rye?
Rye, potatoes, oat, rye.
It's kind of grains.
Grains? Yeah. Think a little bit about like land use in Finland. You know, like what percentage is field agriculture? What are the most effective crops for like producing? Because you know how many millions of people in Finland?
5 million. I think more than 5 million.
More than 5 million. Okay, so producing food for like 5 million people. Land use, potatoes, rye, stuff like that. You just like imagine a process of thinking about survival, because that's what we have on the table. Making sure that, you know, our potatoes, our rye, are these the right way to go? How should the land be used? Questions like that. Just sit a moment and like think about some kind of process of what that would look like. Making sure that the best decisions are made for survival, for growing food. All right. Another question, transportation. People need to get around. How does that happen a lot these days? By car. Keep going. Car, plane.
Public transport.
Public transport. We also ships. Yeah, although there's a couple bikes out there, not as much as the Netherlands, but a few. So we can rate these different forms of transportation in terms of their ecological cost, their emissions, all of that. So think about that process for a little bit. Think about like the land use in Finland with these different means of transportation, and what are their ecological costs? What would it look like to change that? How many of you in these last two little moments could see like a map or like a blueprint? How many of you were like seeing like kind of like a bird's eye view, fields from above, rail networks, car, roads, all that? Probably most of you, I'm guessing, yeah? How many of you were seeing this room right here and thinking, what's outside the door? And thinking, what would you encounter when you go out in the street? When you were thinking about questions of food and transportation, just to name those two examples. Anyone? Nice. So just a couple people. Almost everyone was having a disembodied experience when we were talking about how to make the changes that we need for survival in the territory that we currently all share. That is extremely significant. That is extremely significant that a room of largely anarchists, feminists, and anti-colonial revolutionaries still have disembodied experiences when it comes to think strategy and when it comes to think survival, our survival. It's not a coincidence, and it's not a surprise, because we are trained every day of our lives to have out-of-body experiences in the least healthy way. Because I'm not going to knock it. There's some pretty healthy, useful ways to have disembodied experiences if you come back to your body, if you know how to use what you learn. Not gonna. Anyways, too many tangents. But that kind of dissociation is a fundamental aspect of, for example, patriarchal sociality, and it's a fundamental aspect of the colonial white cosmovision or worldview. To be fully human in the colonial sense of white, a good citizen, a responsible agent of one of these institutions of power that we're supposed to protect, you need to be able to disembody. You need to be able to leave your body behind and fall into this age-old hierarchization of the rational over the corporal, because that is how state rules society. That is how capitalism carries out acts of alienation. That is how patriarchal relations turn us into weapons of destruction against ourselves, against our own communities, against the people we're supposed to care about. That kind of dissociation and disembodiedness is a fundamental feature of colonialism and of these institutions that are maintaining control. And at the very least in like majority white spaces, I never really hear talk about that, even though it is fundamental. That, if you have to find, like, you shouldn't simplify usually, but if you had to find like one fil conductor in Catalan, one string, one common feature going from Extinction Rebellion to Shell Oil, passing through the death squads and the universities and Tesla and Elon Musk, and all those bastards, it is this refusal to question that level of dissociation that we're all trained in. And it's also interesting for folks who do work like around a mental health perspective, questions of dissociation, questions of embodiment become very, very relevant in our lives when we're not able to show up as normal in society, when we're bipolar, when we're crazy, when we have a meltdown. Sometimes our bodies step up and they insist that we pay them attention in a way that's not polite, that's not normal, that's frowned on. And that's something that I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to. Not just because it gets to the heart of like an intersectional analysis, not intersectional like what Twitter means by intersectional, like the list of like, make sure you got your checklist of all the different oppressions, but like actually understanding how it's all the same system and how everyone has a unique experience of the same thing. So it's simultaneously the same thing and different, and it's always already present. Moving towards an embodied focus of our struggles and our questions of survival and what we're facing is necessary to actually moving into intersectional practice. And it's also necessary to tap into our greatest strategic strengths in revolutionary struggles, right? So the pacifists will say, like, well, violence is the government's strong suit, which is why we got to be peaceful, because, you don't beat your enemy fighting them at what they're strongest at. You got to find, like, what you're good at and what you're like, what your strongest advantage is, right? Haven't become a pacifist, don't worry. Part of the problem with that is that the category of violence it's such a vague category, and actually we're like really good at violence sometimes. And like, in the past few years, we've burnt cities, we set cities on fire, and the police haven't been able to stop us. And like again and again in countries that the governments thought they had pacified, people with very little experience were able to rise up and to show that we can actually beat the state. So we do have a great capacity for combat. It's not easy. We lose people, we go to prison, we die, there's trauma afterwards, there's all of these questions that don't get answered in the space of the riot. But certain questions do get answered, certain capacities do come out, and we find that, in fact, we can do beautiful things when we can take over a city. The day after setting all the police cars on fire, we can plant gardens. We can change the power relationships in a neighborhood for the next 10 years. And that's a wonderful thing, and that's a necessary thing. So I'm not here to talk about pacifism, but there are things that are sort of unique strengths to us that the state can never reproduce, that mainstream movements teach us to ignore. And to see those, I think it requires a decentralized and an embodied approach to our own lives, right? Bureaucracies pass themselves off as being very complex things. But in fact, bureaucracies they're not very good at complexity at all. Bureaucracies need to reduce complex reality to a limited number of factors and then plug in the numbers, change the numbers in order to intervene on society. It's state bureaucracies that have this permanent disembodied view looking at society from above to impose a blueprint on society, on life, on the territory. That, if we had to simplify, and again, word of caution before simplifying, because it's better to dance with the complexity, but for the purposes of communication, every now and then we do have to simplify. If we had to talk about a fundamental state activity, it is the imposition of a blueprint on a territory. And a blueprint is always much more simple than the territory. Someone who's going off the blueprint never understands the territory. And in fact, it is an existential priority for the state not to understand the territory and to make sure that no one actually ends up inhabiting the territory, that no one understands the territory. Because if people understand the territory, then they understand things that the state doesn't. They tap into a strength that the state can never access. They tap into this guerrilla force that is really at the heart of many of the most effective and long-lasting revolutionary movements and anti-colonial movements around the world. This insistence on inhabiting the territory, honoring the territory, knowing the territory, and not joining the side of those who make the blueprint and impose the blueprint on the territory. A blueprint is always an act of violence on the territory, whether it's for planning, putting in a coal mine, or organizing a neighborhood that's easier to police, or making some decision from some government bureaucracy that, well, we should be planting more potatoes this year because if you plug in the numbers, it's more efficient. And that's why we also get tricked into going along with those discourses and those proposals instead of realizing we inhabit the territory. We have the possibility of knowing this territory better than they ever could. And so when we need to think about our food, our transportation, our survival, we are right here. We are seeing through our own eyes, hearing with our ears, feeling with our own bodies. We are in this room. We are sharing this collective space that would not exist if we hadn't all come here together. And after this, we choose what to do. And it involves going out that door. It involves having conversations. It involves looking at the land outside of your apartment, seeing what could be squatted. It involves looking at rail lines that could be blocked, highways that could be blocked. It involves conversations that could be had with people that you actually share a lot with if you take it from a perspective of survival rather than from a perspective of more superficial political identities. It involves recognizing that that's hard fucking work and it's not going to be easy, but all of our survival is on the line. And I mean, video games aren't that fun anyways, so we might as well. What else are we going to do? Tapping into that territorialized, embodied perspective gives us a guerrilla strength and ability to move with complexity that takes away all of the advantages of the state, that makes us ungovernable, and that taps us into an intelligence in which entirely new solutions can come forth, that no university, that no NGO, that no politician could ever conceive of. Because they always have to reduce things to the blueprint. They have to cut things down to a few factors that they can just plug in the numbers, play with the numbers, so that they maintain the control. That's the fundamental feature of all their strategies, is simplifying things so that they have the monopoly on the proposals. And that's why we need to be vociferously and enthusiastically rejecting that colonial and white and patriarchal way of engaging with the world. Because it is an act of violence against life, and because it is absolute complicity in our own domination and in our own daily diminishing prospects of survival. There's, I'm just going to talk about bees for a little second, like bees and ants. There's this idea that like bees have like queens, which like is silly. Like they don't, very few people have ever been stupid enough to have like kings and queens. The English, the Dutch, a couple others. Forgetting anyone? Anyways, bees don't have queens. They wouldn't put up with that. They have different types of bees with different roles. They carry out different activities. And there's this kind of mainstream science has this prejudice towards hierarchical forms of knowledge. And in fact, there's a great deal of intelligence in a bee colony, in a bee home, or in also an ant colony. Very intelligent decisions are made. Hundreds or thousands of individuals are constantly making decisions, making tunnels, repairing tunnels, collecting food, making medicines, taking care of eggs, taking care of babies, keeping it all going. And not a single individual is in charge. Not a single individual has what we can refer to, thinking about blueprints, as the bird's eye view. In fact, bees and ants, if they're smart, they like to stay out of the bird's eye view because they know that the bird is there to eat them. They know that stay out of the camera. Don't let yourself be surveilled. What they do, and when certain humans signed, I'm sure many people who just watched bees and ants and just asked the bees and ants what they were doing knew this a long time ago. But we have the scientists to back us up now too. When they started studying how does collective intelligence and decision making work in bee families and ant families, what they noticed, it's really cute. Every time two ants or two bees cross paths, they give a little kiss. And they're exchanging information, pheromones, like how they're doing, if they're hungry, what they've been up to, if they're stressed. And from that information, every single individual gets a complex view of the whole. Not a single one of these individuals has an objective view. None of them have an objective view. Every single one is going to have a slightly different picture of the whole. Not a single one of these individuals has something that could be used to make the blueprint, to make the official report. Okay, BNGO is saying, all right, the numbers are in. This last year, honey production was up, but the tunnel repair needs some improvements. But we calculated that if we increase our wax production by 5% objectively, no one has that information. That information does not exist. Every single individual has a subjective picture. Now, if they did not have a lot of relations, if there were not high connectivity, if there were not a lot of solidarity and communication, they would all be pretty dumb. They would, I talked to Bob and Joe yesterday, and they both had food, so I guess we're all fine, so I'm just going to watch BTV. They talk as much as possible. They share as much as possible. And it's only because of that high connectivity that they are able to create this collective intelligence that is far superior to any kind of centralized possibility of intelligence. But in order to access that, they need to give up on the myth, on this mania, this, any Spanish speakers here? This is whatever, it's psychological. What's that?
Obsession?
Yeah, this obsession, yeah. For the objective picture, for the blueprint. The blueprint, the objective picture, does not give us the most intelligent possibilities for decision making. What gives us the most intelligent possibilities for decision making are solidarity, connectivity, communication, mutual aid, breaking our alienation, sharing, and also accepting that the inevitable conflict of the differences is a part of life. It is in fact sometimes the best stuff of life, sometimes the worst stuff of life. We, in any kind of collective movement, we suffer a whole lot. Without a doubt, have been shot at by cops and in prison a couple times and stuff like that. Without any doubt, I have been hurt much more by comrades than by cops and all those fuckers. We're very bad at that a lot of the time. That is real. We need to be real about that. Nonetheless, conflict is a part of life. We need to accept that we're never all going to have consensus. We're never all going to agree. And all the same, we need to keep coming back to one another. We need to keep coming back to these collective spaces to learn how to do it better. Again, in particularly majority white spaces, I would say that we need to learn a lot more about what transformative justice is. And we need to accept that what gets talked about as transformative justice on social media is the opposite of what it actually is. And if you haven't read, for example, the Black feminists coming from the Black liberation struggle and anti-colonial struggles, and as a result of that, anti-prison struggles, then we're just going to be getting into comfort politics, which is just a reproduction of the prison logic. So I think, speaking personally, as just one little ant with just the information that I have, and not everybody's information, in my circles, I see that there is a huge, huge need to put a lot of emphasis into learning what transformative justice actually means. And that's impossible if we continue to act with disrespect towards these historical revolutionary Black feminist struggles who actually really developed the concept. Also, from other historical trajectories, a lot of indigenous movements are relying on their own traditions of different practices of transformative justice. Generally, white people suck at it, and we think we're great at it, and we think that we're going to learn enough about it by reading other white people on Twitter, and fuck that, no. we need to get better at transformative justice, at conflict, embracing it, being compassionate. We're gonna fuck up. We're not gonna be perfect. But if we can take criticism, if we can keep trying, if we can try to do better and show up with love, take distance when we have to, but accept that like until we die, we're still here. So we got to find some way forward. We'll be in a much better place if we can do that. Personally, I think we need to do a lot better with like mental health stuff. It's been hard these last years. Like just have, so much of the time just kind of wanting to commit suicide and not really being able to talk about that, and like knowing that a lot of other people have that too, and like it's actually a pretty healthy, normal response. But like we live in a society in which it's very like rewarded to be able to like have no emotional complexity and just kind of adapt to monstrosity. And I don't think that that's a value that we should really celebrate. And yeah, I mean, there's so much we need to be doing, and so much that we are doing, and I've just been blown away by like all the people who have kept me alive, all these years and decades in struggle, all the people that I've met briefly or at more length, and yeah, I tricked y'all here with like a talk about the ecological crisis, but like when I said that certain definition of ecological, that it's about ecos, it's about home, like that's what I'm talking about. It's like it's about the possibility of survival. It's about the home that we create together, because if we don't create that and protect it and defend it, we're all in a really bad place. And so I think in the end it becomes impossible to talk about questions of pollution and questions of climate if we're not also talking about our health, if we're not also talking about our movements, if we're not talking about the kinds of conversations we need to be having. And that doesn't mean like navel gazing. It doesn't mean like, just like creating like perfected groups where we just take care of each other. It needs to be expansive. It needs to be solidaristic. It needs to always like go out and like you can't be healthy in a bubble, right? Like the poisons are going to get in. The poisons are already in here with us. So we need to be always going back to the streets and fighting, and then always coming home again and healing, licking our wounds, learning, and then going out and coming back in again. In the organizing we've been doing in Catalonia these last years, I found it really useful to kind of like break with like a kind of rationalist expectation of like movements need to grow geometrically, and shift into kind of more seasonal work, and like recognize like this is a moment of like coming together and like digesting lessons. This is a moment for going to the streets and attacking and fighting and setting things on fire. This is a moment for meeting our neighbors and talking with our neighbors, and just kind of like finding like the seasons. It'll be different in every territory. Like you don't trust someone from like somewhere else to like say, you should be doing it here, but like trust your intuition, trust each other, but like look for those rhythms, and just don't trust the institutions and their colonial worldviews of like, a successful movement is one that grows geometrically. Don't trust books too much. We have too many books. I mean, thank you for being here. And if it's a resource, great. But there are so many parts of the movement that are so much more valuable than like writing or talking. And I just want to name the comrades who have put so much energy into questions of healing, into questions of conflict resolution, into questions of being supportive. That's what keeps us alive. And so there is like this, continued patriarchal value hierarchy in terms of like what kinds of movement activity get valued more than others. And it's bullshit. It doesn't work. It doesn't keep us alive. It doesn't make us effective at struggle. If there is any use for like a inspiring, motivational, happy talk, I hope that some of what I've shared has been useful, but it'll only be useful if it contributes to what y'all are doing here in your bodies, in your territory, in this situation that we're all facing of collective survival, because that's the real work. That's what's important. Thank you so much for sharing this space with me. So there will be that workshop tomorrow, which will be looking at maybe inspiring and effective struggles around the world, and then with like a goal towards like not making blueprints, of course, but like maybe teasing out interesting patterns that could be useful for inspiring more action here. So just if you want to get the texts for that, there's a sign-up sheet or something on the back. And I mean, if folks want to stay around for longer, I'm happy to talk about like a couple inspiring things from around the world, but of like different projects. But again, that'll be the focus for tomorrow. So
if people have any reflections, thoughts, questions, comments, please now is the time, now is the space that we can open up. How people feel like discussing.
Stream some questions and some others we don't stream. Let's first those who can be on the stream.
Questions with screen?
I want to say one thing about the terminology, because that is, I think, often a problem. You have been talking about climate crisis and referring to like the term ecological crisis. And
can you speak up, please?
Yes, I will try. I think it would be good to to use the term climate crisis, but expand the idea of what climate is. We are told that climate is the weather, right, or the seasons. And I think if we go back to what you also said about like what has colonialism and capitalist disenfranchising of ourselves has been doing to us, I would count that as a climate crisis as well, and see climate as something socio-political as well, that has been destroying our solidarity, that has been destroying our empathy, that has been like creating a great deal of alienation, which I think is a really helpful term, and it has been on the menu already like a long time ago from a philosophical context. But it is, of course, a political thing that if we are alienated from ourselves and from each other and from the land we live in, then that is the climate we live in, which is the reality that many people feel like helpless and alone and complete lack of solidarity, even in like circles like we are now. I find it really hard to find actual community and actual solidarity that is based on these existential things that you have been like describing very eloquently. And if we use the term climate, like understand that this is part of the climate and this is the crisis, and try to change that according to what you said as well. I think it is a useful term, and it can adapt to this like common discourse about climate, but we just have to like hijack that with these kind of ideas, I think. So thank you very much.
I think it would have been really nice to sit in a circle instead of like this.
Yeah.
I feel like these are really hard and vulnerable topics. And it would have just felt nice to be able to look people in the eye and feel the solidarity and feel the togetherness.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
How do you think, like, if we all focus on like changing the spaces we are at, and all the activists are focusing maybe on growing potatoes or focusing on the life, and then the capitalists just keep on doing what they do, and like how to focus on life itself at the same time as trying to change it somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think movements need to be diverse. Like inevitably, they will be diverse. So I think it's important to look at strategic connections between different kinds of activities, because oftentimes we're convinced to separate between respectable projects and unrespectable projects, or like well, these people have their, eco potato farm and that's acceptable and that's okay. Those people are, organizing like anti-border actions, which if they're white citizens doing it as charity, then that's okay. But if they're the migrants themselves, then that's dangerous. And those people are setting fire to cop cars. Like, it's like all of those things can create an ecosystem where they're feeding each other, nurturing each other, or they can stay separate and not intersect. And if they do that, then we'll be completely controlled and unthreatening, I think.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very wonderful and touching. And I had a few things I also disagree with. And I was thinking about first of all, you were referring to they are not giving the information, and you were saying at some point the decision makers, and I was very happy to hear that. Like specifically, I would maybe have wished for more, like even more specific, and also a big critique for science as like one block at the university. Of course, there is a lot of diversity there as well, and I think I don't know if it's in this book or if it's in another book. You also refer to Kropotkin yourself, I guess the first scientist that write about climate change already end of
Yeah, I don't think I referred to him as the first, but as an early one.
Yeah. And then maybe also like that's another critique when you speak very positive. I mean, I do agree with the solidarity and very nice analysis of the ants, but also like what Kropotkin was also saying about the mutual aid, that it's not only the mutual aid, but also also competition, not to romanticize nature. And there was also the reference to the swans and the moving birds, and I should say the swans, they do also attack people sometimes.
I can empathize.
And maybe also like one when we are speaking about this, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed, and it's like a big crisis and so on. And I was thinking about, it would be very nice. I'm sorry I can't be here tomorrow, but just to hear about those solutions. And they're like that we were like making the example of different crops, like what can be grown here. My friend here introduced me to a wheat for carousel, for example, like an alternative to wheat. So at least for myself, like it's very interesting to know about. That kind of knowledge is not so accessible, so just to know about those kind of seeds that could be an alternative to wheat production, that would be like perennial seed and like take the nutrition and water from meters down and so on.
Thank you particularly for complexifying the thing about academics. The academic institutions, I think, need to be analyzed as like a part of the colonial system, but like that book would not have been possible without the support of solidaristic academics and friends with like the resources to do levels of research that I'm not capable of doing. So yeah, there's a small minority like in general, but like all of the good academics I know like hate academia more than I do, and they like distrust it. So yeah, we need the systemic critique, but also like to be very grateful towards the unfortunate people who stay on the inside and get those resources, because it's I wouldn't have been able to do that book without some of those research resources.
I have a question. I'm not really sure how to form it, so I'm kind of like looking for it now. Like, because we were talking about this kind of territorial embodied experience as a means of struggle, or as a kind of a base idea of struggle, like somehow to frame it. So how do you what kind of like a concrete ways of finding this kind of territorial embodied experience or embodied kind of a way of struggle you would like find in an urban area where we live in an urban kind of surrounding, where we're not actually part of any kind of maybe such a concrete territorial area, because I find that this kind of territorial embodied experience you can find a lot easier when you're actually part of some kind of more rural community, at least like I've experienced this.
Yeah.
So once you live in this urban surrounding, like what kind of like, I don't know, ways there are when you're talking about this like really embodied experience as a means of struggle, like can you somehow clarify this idea?
When I was living in Barcelona, I found it to be like a very positive development when there was a sort of change of focus towards neighborhood assemblies. So we were still, many of us still organizing together as anarchists, but instead of like only being interested in anarchists and organizing like always on like a citywide level with like the anarchist anti-prison assembly and the anarchist feminist assembly and then like stuff like that, we had these more territorially rooted neighborhood assemblies. Interestingly, one of the activities that many of these assemblies started doing was like recovering anti-capitalist history of the neighborhood and doing kind of like walking history tours. Some of us started participating in squatting vacant lots and turning them into gardens, and those were typically projects that were not ideologically pure, but were, with other neighbors who weren't anarchists, which is of course very important to not just organize in homogenous groups. It could have gone further, but that was like I think that was a useful and appropriate step towards getting to know the area and its history better, connecting more specifically to like neighborhood resources, having more opportunities to meet with other like broader groups of neighbors. And so then in 2011, when the 15M movement broke out, we already had like a different neighborhood assembly that was not just anarchist, that could serve as sort of like a nucleus. We were just 15 people meeting every 2 weeks. But then all of a sudden, when there was like a change in society and more people realized like they also they needed some more tools of resistance with like, the economic crisis and crises of legitimacy and the democracy there and blah, blah, blah. Before that, we thought that like no one had any idea what we were doing. We were cuatro gatos. We were like 15 people in the neighborhood association office meeting every 2 weeks. But then when you had hundreds of thousands of people gathering in Plaza Catalunya, thousands of people, just random people, started coming to this information tent looking for the contacts of their neighborhood assemblies. And there were only 6 neighborhoods at that point that had independent neighborhood assemblies. All of us had the same experience, that we thought we were totally isolated and irrelevant. But in fact, we had planted some seeds in like a broader consciousness, so that thousands of people were coming up and asking how to get in touch with us. And the next week, it was brilliant because all of like the direct democracy centralizing activists and like the kind of progressives who wanted to control things, they were like, we got to keep everyone in Plaza Catalunya as long as possible because eventually we can turn into a new political party or something like that. And we got everyone to like go back to the neighborhoods. So like the next week, about 20 different neighborhoods had neighborhood assemblies, most of them for the first time in a public place, taking over their parks with like 200 to 300 people in the streets every week. And that was only possible because we had decided to change the way that we were relating with the urban environment. It's difficult because there are a lot. There are definitely tools of like dispossession in rural capitalism and urban capitalism, but the tools of like keeping us mobile and rootless in cities are very powerful and well developed, and we can't resist them if we're not specifically organizing to resist them. So just to air a little bit of dirty laundry, like one of my like big movement disappointments back in the day around the time that I left Barcelona was like in our specific anarchist assembly, we had done an analysis and some of us said, there is a danger of gentrification also in our neighborhood. We're not in a central neighborhood, not a tourist neighborhood. We need to start resisting this danger of gentrification now. And there was maybe an academic or two in the group who were like experts in gentrification. And they had studied what gentrification looked like, in the original models, like, in like the UK, like 50 years ago. And they're like, no. Look at the numbers. There's no danger of gentrification in our neighborhood. This is not relevant. And they hadn't calculated things like Airbnb, that you can have gentrification without rising rents. If people giving up their houses can become their only access to. Anyways, I'm still bitter. We lost the neighborhood. We had a chance. We made a strategy. We didn't put it into effect. But those things aren't inevitable. We need to be aware of our surroundings. We need to be aware of the next fights. And absolutely, people who live in cities need to understand that if life isn't possible in the city, then like, why are you here? It is possible in the city. And there are many different forms of life that are living illegally or marginally in the city, and we need to be on their side, and we need to strategize about how we can turn cities more into places of life rather than just real estate markets. I can't offer much more than that because for the past 8 years I've been on the outskirts of a very small city with my little squatted olive orchard and our little, it's very atypical. We have like a neighborhood assembly, but it also fell apart because of internal conflicts. And so, yeah. Failure is our greatest shared legacy, but we just turn it into compost.
Just to follow that up, in the version of a revolution, having assemblies throughout the whole society to build a new society is just that is seen as a way, and having alongside them academies, which are free learning societies that people form autonomously on anything throughout the whole society, outside universities, outside the colleges, outside all that formal academia. Then having the cooperatives, the people together, the workers and people and community are running these enterprises for their own needs and so on. And then the communists, which is not the state. So I'm just any reflection that they're doing this, it's a revolution. Of course they're surrounded and assaulted, attacked every day. But it's there. And it's built on those 4 pillars. It's what you build. If you want to build this, this is what you do. And of course, radical and absolute equality and empowerment of women throughout the entire society. And all those 4 the same. Radical equality, empowerment of women, leadership, life, food.
Yeah, the Kurdish struggle has without a doubt been like a huge inspiration, and lots of friends and comrades are either like direct part of that struggle or inspired by that struggle. Personally, in the context that I come from and struggle from, I find it very, very necessary to have a distinction between decentralization and direct democracy, and a strong criticism of direct democracy as a very powerful means of the colonization of our movements. But I understand that we're referring to different histories of those terms, different uses of those terms. And like, I mean, I don't need to, have consensus or exact agreement with people I'm in solidarity with. Like, there's still processes of like mutual inspiration and solidarity. But a lot of what I do is focusing on making a strong criticism of direct democracy, because in Catalonia, in the States, direct democracy has been, and again, different uses of the term, but I think there's like histories there that need to be fleshed out. And there's no one movement that like is offering, a global solution. And anyone, I'm not trying to like offer my perspective as like the universally valid solution. I just find that in a lot of places of the world, there's been like a need to have like a instead of just like fascism versus democracy, to have like a distinction between like fascism or authoritarianism, democratic forms of government, and then decentralized forms of self-organization. But all my love to the Kurdish struggle for sure.
Hi, thank you so much. Coming from like radical disability organizing, the disembodiment element was so like refreshing and vitalizing to hear you reflect that and like try to embody that. So I guess I want to ask, like, in your experience, like, what have been some of the important tools, things you learned, resources that have helped you become less disembodied and like less colonized in your body mind?
I'm gonna stray a little dangerously close to individualist liberal therapy. Getting over man complexes and like actually just like getting fucking therapy, like the finding one that like works, but then like not keeping it as an individual process and like sharing the things that I learn in my communities and like and recognizing that therapists cannot offer tools of collective liberation, but they can maybe help you work out your shit so that you like don't hurt your own comrades, but can actually show up for the people you care about and show up for yourself. So yeah, and not, you know, any amazing answer, but like it took me long enough to find it, so I'll just offer it out there. I've been really inspired by like a lot of like comrades whose focus is like disability activism and like the just how well they embody practices of mutual aid, how good they are at like finding resources in the system. Like, yeah, I mean, I was like kind of avoided a lot of like my own health needs and issues and stuff like that just by like squatting for a long time and like avoiding like a need for wage labor, which worked to a certain extent, but yeah, like it doesn't really help us to have like these kind of like dogmatic ideas of like purism, like that, you know, like if you can get things for free, great, but like get the shit however you can get it and share it. Yeah. So thank you for
thanks.
naming that.
Any other reflections?
Can you just turn?
Yeah, maybe I switch off the recording the screen.